And this is the first full-blown crisis of a fully globalized capitalism. It is a crisis of globalization, a crisis of this global capitalism, and it is happening precisely because of the extent of the globalization of capitalism, like that. It's been recently said by no less than a deputy governor of the Bank of England, I believe, in charge of financial stability, that the present global financial crisis is perhaps the greatest crisis in the history of the world. So no hyperbole there then.
The regulation supervision was only looking at supporting the competitiveness of the financial sector, not looking at what the savers, what interest was, what was the environment, what was the interest of the society that was sustainable. They would like, it was not. I mean, even if social responsibility was being discussed, it was voluntary. There was no mandate nowhere whereby, as well, the regulators and the supervisors had to look at what the instability on society might be. Resulting from the operations of these conglomerates.
Private financial markets are innovating and finding every way they can to get around whatever minimal regulation may be left in order to maximize profits by any ruthless means necessary. And they'll do as much as you let them get away with. And regulators are always behind trying to figure out what these smart whiz kids are doing. And then their toolkit is from the last great crisis. So it's already way out of date anyway. They try to fight the last war and use the techniques they were in their textbook, but everything's changed. They don't understand it. They let it get totally out of their control. We have antiquated institutions, antiquated theory and ideas that can't cope with managing a globalized capitalist crisis. We go back to the Reagan counter-revolution, the overturning of the post-war Keynesian doctrine, and the invoking of the free market, anti-statist ideology and monetarist economic theory at the time. And that was the birth of neoliberal economic globalization, the financialization of capital, free market fundamentalism, which we've lived with for 25 years, which are now almost universally condemned by practically everyone. There's an emerging consensus that those are the causes of the crisis, which is an interesting step that we've gotten to very quickly indeed.
Deregulation and globalization kicked in, and it became the consensus. It became the story of the city of Washington. Anyone, whether in a Republican administration or in President Clinton's Democratic administration, that sought to try to engage in regulation of markets was brushed aside. I can imagine that if you were someone with a professional mission who saw yourself as a regulator in one of the regulatory authorities in Washington during the 1990s when a Democrat was president, or during this decade when a Republican was president, and sitting around a table and saying, wait a minute, shouldn't we know something about these derivatives? Shouldn't we know something about credit default swaps? You would very quickly learn that you had no room at that table, and if you wanted to keep your career going at all, you would either say nothing or play along or quit. And that did happen. So this convinces me, when you look at the trajectory of what was tried and failed, that this is a serious systemic crisis of not just the financial system, but a crisis of ideology, which we all in this room, I think, understand, a crisis of governance, which Miriam talked about, a crisis of politics, and a crisis of intellectual thought, because no one has been thinking about what, in specific enough terms, but yet with a strong enough progressive political cast, to replace it with. So unlike in other areas where the last 20, 25 years the left has been very effective in thinking about what to replace it with, if there was ever a chance to replace it, we have not in this case.
If a great deal of the source of the problem is the excessive concentration of wealth and the extreme ideology in favor of capital, of this, freedom for capital, then the solution lies in reversing those things. I mean, that for the last 25 years, there's been an enormous cultural battle, I guess you'd say, to try to delegitimize state action. Anti-statist means pro-market, right? So, I mean, there's a fear of anything approaching state authority over the economy that's been inculcated in everyone, but which serves certain interests. So one thing we have to do is disabuse ourselves of just some irrational fear about state authority or the mixed economy. I mean, we also had the extremes of privatization, privatize everything, commodify everything, universal commodification, which has contributed to our collapse into the global crisis and climate change crisis, right? So I mean, we have to go into reverse course on all of these disastrous ideas and interests.
There is in Holland a discussion on alternatives. We had the big conference in Tilburg and we have the declaration there, and it's going much further than what we've just said. It's saying the growth model is a problem. There are other values that are important. The climate change is there, it has to prioritize. Of course it's going to be difficult when there is a depression. But I think Susan is also saying, well, it can be an opportunity to create jobs, even to solve those problems. I think the other problem that we have to make sure is that we don't try to find one model. I think there's some parts of globalization that have to diminish, but at the same time, we still want kind of, equity, sustainability to be in globalized, but the solutions have to be regional. So when we are able to kind of get some of the things more local, if they can be local, and regional and national, or big continental if they can, and that's where the solution have to be found, and where democracy and citizens come in. But the thinking of, the growth, the model of growth is the real problem. Every time again, we're trying to get it. I think that's still something that hasn't been thought through.
We have to say enough is enough. We have been unable to influence the discourse. We have not been able to influence what goes on in the higher spheres of finance, sometimes because we simply didn't understand. I can't say I understood what was going on. I've tried to catch up since. But I encourage you all to go to the site, Casino Crash, where there is a wealth of information about what has been happening, and it's changing every day. But do get up to speed on what is happening, because that is what will make you an effective citizen.